Hello. So let's start. So hello and welcome. So the evening will be in English, and our guest, Robert Trafford, will be online. So he's in Berlin, actually. And so first of all, a very warm welcome to you, Bob. And yeah, it's very nice to having you with us. So we have a group of fans, I think, here for forensic architecture, and that's a great pleasure that you could make it to give this speech tonight. So also a very warm welcome to our guests online. How many are online, Katharina? 15. So I think we are a good group, and thank you all for joining. And for those online, so you are muted, but you can bring in your questions and commentaries in the chat. And after the lecture or the talk, there is a Q&A, and then Katharina will also read out some of your questions and comments. So yeah, let's start with the title. So the title of this talk is "How can artistic research be activated in pursuit of accountability?" And Robert Trafford is going to present forensic architecture and its artistic investigative method, focusing on the example of the terrorist attack in Hanau on February 19th in 2020. And some of you might have seen this installation. It was on display in Frankfurt a couple of years ago. And just for those who are not familiar with forensic architecture, so forensic architecture is a name of, or the name of an interdisciplinary academic research group at the Goldsmiths Centre for Research Architecture at the University of London. It was founded in 2010. The center defines itself as a human rights research agency, and I thought in our times it's important to also give voice to such agency. That was the reason why I invited them in the framework of Cedra Moon Murphy's exhibition, which is downstairs. And for those who haven't seen the exhibition, it will be open afterwards, so you will have a chance to go through. Just a few words to Robert. He is a journalist and deputy director of forensic architecture. He has led, for example, forensic architecture's investigations in this terrorist attack in Hanau, and also into the murder of Mark Duggan in London by the London police in 2011, and the high-profile triple chaser investigation, which was on display at the Whitney Biennial in 2019. So Robert, a very warm welcome again, and we are very much looking forward to your lecture, and I hand over to you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon and good evening, everybody. Yes, thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you very much to the team, to Katharina, to Heidi and colleagues. Thank you to Cedra Moon Murphy for the opportunity to speak in the context of your exhibition, Groundwork. I'm really sorry that I couldn't be there with you all in person and to see the exhibition. I'm going to speak this evening about the work of forensic architecture. As has just been introduced, we are a research agency based at Goldsmiths, University of London. We have a sister agency, an NGO here in Berlin, Forensis, whose offices I'm calling you from now. I want to speak with you particularly this evening about our work on the case of the neo-Nazi terror attack in Hanau, which occurred on the 19th of February 2020. And the survivors and bereaved families of which attack we have worked with since 2021. After which time I will be delighted to be in discussion with you all and to hear some of your questions. But first, I'd like to begin. I'm sorry, I've just been told that I'm having network connection issues by the software. Do you hear me okay? Hello?
Yeah, kannst du kurz
Do you hear us okay?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes, we can hear you.
wonderful. Thank you very much. Do just shout if you can't. Okay. So I want to start by reflecting a little bit on what I think it is that connects our work to that of Sidra and this exhibition. Sidra's exhibition Groundwork explores, indeed, its title refers to, the often concealed foundational preparatory work undertaken by militaries, by states, by police, preparatory work, the contents and form of which later becomes legible to the public only in its consequence, and often in acts of violence, conflict and war particularly. Interrogated by this exhibition then are both concealed objects themselves, such as the training manual, which is on display in the exhibition, but also the act of concealment itself. The show also engages with FOI requests, freedom of information requests, and the ways in which states manipulate the character of requests and manipulate the contents that are released in response to those requests. And as a journalist, before I came to forensic architecture, this is a particular form of groundwork which is close to my heart. The exhibition also presents inaccessible black box flight recorders, which of course store but withhold information from public. Now, as some of you will know, we are a research agency based in digital research practices. Our work is founded in 3D modeling, architectural and spatial analysis, open source investigation, and what is sometimes called visual forensics. And forensic architecture exists today, or as it exists today, was born in a period in the early 2010s that we refer to as the open source revolution. This was a time in which profound technological changes to our information environment were driving really tectonic social and political changes, the consequences of which we are still living in today and likely to live in for some time. And those profound generational shifts in our information environment created opportunities never seen before to puncture the cordon that states erect around information, to access elements of that groundwork to which Sidra refers, exploiting really as, in order to do that, certain contradictions, what Trafford has called the contradictions between materiality and secrecy. In short, FA came to exist because conflict, violence, and human rights violations became heavily mediatized in ways which, as we are increasingly familiar with, seem to make the truth of what had occurred in certain documented instances at times seem less clear rather than more. Chemical weapons attacks by the former Syrian regime here in Duma in 2018 were a very powerful example. Information at this stage was really for the first time in human history pouring out of active conflict zones in such scale and so unmediated and unfiltered that a certain information environment was born within which we still live, and an information environment which created new possibilities for disinformation, denial, and cover-up by state actors. And so in a way, forensic architecture began as a set of technical and theoretical tools for unpacking mediatized and disputed events using evidence newly dispersed across the public domain, where information relating to secret or unaccounted for military bases, or indeed, as you're seeing here, information documenting chemical weapons attacks was leaking out into the public sphere. This precisely is what I believe Trafford was gesturing towards when he talks about those contradictions between materiality and secrecy. It was, if brief, a tremendous boon for the human rights community that all of a sudden there were inescapable contradictions between the presence of the legibility, the material legibility of state crimes in the public domain, and that the combination of that condition with a new and rich ability for investigators in our position, what we call open source research community, to exploit those new information conditions. So here what you've seen is a clip from our investigation of a 2018 chemical weapons attack in a suburb of Damascus, Duma. And what you're looking at here are, in fact, images taken by enthusiastic pro-Assad regime reporters. These are Russian reporters, and in a very archetypal example of how our field was able to exploit those new conditions to upend traditional power dynamics, certainly the kinds of power dynamics which I believe this concept of groundwork engages with. We were able to use the same material that these reporters put into the public domain to push certain pro-Assad and pro-Putin narratives about the conditions of this attack. We were able to use that same evidence and new tools, digital tools, to back and indeed entirely overturn the narratives that they hoped that media would promote. And in this light, what is common, I think, between our work and that of Sidra is our interest in the threshold between the public and the private, between state and civil. Now, that might be a physical barrier or a cordon, like the police tape that's the crime scene. It may be a threshold of privileged access to technology or resources, as in the forensic laboratory. It may be itself the privilege to set the rules of evidence, as in the courtroom. That threshold between the public and private can be legible in many different forms and in different spaces. But these three spaces, the crime scene, the lab, the courtroom, these are the three stages of forensics as we traditionally understand it, as essentially police investigation. Each of these places are the sites of ground of the preparatory, concealed, privilege operation of state power. And when the state forensic process operates as it is designed, the state's agents secure the crime scene, gather evidence, they analyze that evidence in sealed space, and on that basis bring a perpetrator to court and render verdict, sentence. That process is problematized, of course, when the actions of state agents are themselves implicated. And it is here that our work enters, and for this reason that we call our work counter-forensics, drawing from the counter-cartographies of Edward Said, of course. Counter-forensics is multimodal civil society practice, which seeks to respond to certain modes of authority by the experimental interaction of disciplines and practices. Where groundwork invites us to imagine, even reveals to us the material fundamentals underlying the privileged and often violent operations of the state, fundamentals which are often hidden, which leak out by fortune or by the bravery of whistleblowers. Forensic architecture's work can be understood as experiments in puncturing that cordon, seeking to move from the material traces of those acts of state violence through the careful assemblage of those traces back across that cordon, to shine light on otherwise hidden processes and to challenge state counts. Now, that may entail reading intention and strategic vision in patterns of rights violations, as in our work last year, the cartography of genocide. Genocide, according to Raphael Lemkin, is a process rather than a single act, and it is composed of the relation between many different acts of persecution and destruction. And so our premise in respect to the cartography of genocide is that what motivates the ongoing genocide in Gaza is legible through the interrelation between the evidence of different violent acts. Here, what you see are different data sets overlaid upon one another, many thousands of data points, which add up to an assessment that critical characteristics of the assault on Gaza are not a side effect of armed encounters, but rather clearly follow a spatial design motivated by common settler colonial logics. And in this way, it is the establishment of patterns between acts which carries us from the public to the private, to the logics motivating this ongoing genocide, to the groundwork for the brutal ungrounding of Gaza. I want to turn now to our investigation in Hanau. It's an investigation and a context from which we have learned a great deal about our own practice, about the civil society practices that are made necessary by the state's refusal to investigate, refusal to reveal, to self-interrogate, or to admit failure. We were invited in September of 2021 by the initiative 19 Februar Hanau to join them and the families with and on whose behalf they work. The initiative, as with many initiatives that have formed in Germany in response to acts of racist right-wing violence, is a networked, flexible, sensitive, politically astute, highly robust, and decentralized organization. They are at the same time advocates, activists, researchers, support structure, family, civil society investigators with a huge wealth of expertise and an understanding of the need to work across forums. That is to say that the pursuit of accountability, the initiative understands, as we do, is a multi-platform project. Specifically, the initiative 19 Februar Hanau asked us to help them to understand why the police operation on the night of the attack, how it had unfolded, why it had failed to apprehend the perpetrator despite knowing where he was, for example. And this question offers an important perspective on how forensic architecture understands the value of its contributions in moments such as this, when we enter into and join struggles with bereaved family members that you see here and their supporters in the initiative 19 Februar. Because even in the hours and days following the attack in Hanau, which occurred on the 19th of February 2020, in those early days after the attack, this was of course the days when the world was coming to terms with the COVID pandemic, and the pressures of that new condition saw Hanau slip from the front pages quite quickly. Even in the hours and those hours and days after the attack, the families of the victims were subjected to aggression, insensitivity, carelessness, hostility by police. Families were dragged from their cars at gunpoint while waiting to see their children's bodies. They knew through these experiences that occurred in those first hours and days that the police response to Hanau, to the attack in Hanau, and to its antecedents and its consequences, they knew that this operation had been a chaotic failure, and they knew that this was a failure that was evidently born out of a lack of care. And our task, forensic architecture's contribution in entering this struggle, was to augment that understanding, to somehow make it into what constitutes evidence in certain forums, particularly legal and political forums, but also in cultural forums, as we will come to see. And we see that in part ours is a rhetorical and aesthetic mission, as well as a forensic investigative practice, and those two things are not so disconnected. It's a mission which seeks to unlock and to provoke and to respond, to provoke indeed a response from a state which, when faced with grieving families of children with names like Gürbüz, Gültekin, Kirpach, finds it often preferable and all too easy to give really no response, no answer whatsoever. And so forensic architecture enters into this struggle, seeking to bring the digital technical practices that have made our reputation to bear in support of the situated experience and claims of these bereaved families and indeed survivors of the attack. Now, notably, the initiative 19 Februar drew inspiration from the initiative 6 April, which formed in the wake of the murder of Halit Yozgat, whose death at the hands of the NSU in the presence of a Verfassungsschützer agent, we at Forensic Architecture also investigated. This was the second time that we had returned to the state of Hessen to talk about right-wing extremism and police failure, complicity. In many ways, the case of the killing of Halit Yozgat was similar. It was a similar catalogue of failure and carelessness and callousness and incompetence from state authorities, which had itself and the response by the initiative indeed had used innovative strategies of exhibition, public presentations, citizens' tribunals, to augment and elevate the knowledge within these communities victimized by the violence of the NSU, but doubly victimized by the slow violence of the state that followed. So I want to take you short two aspects of our investigations. I would invite you all to visit our website and view these investigations in full. I do hope that we'll have an opportunity to present them in Germany again sometime later this year. Our investigation began at the second attack site, a rundown cafe and late night kiosk called the Arena Bar. 4 people were killed inside this bar and kiosk, and one, Willi Viorel Paun, who famously followed the perpetrator from the first attack site in Neumarkt to the second attack site here in Hanau-Kesselstadt, was killed in his car just outside. Now, the Arena Bar was a very heavily surveilled space, 6 CCTV cameras. You see their coverage of the space here on the left, in a room of maybe 25 square meters. Now, it's arguable, and indeed robustly arguable, that such overwhelming surveillance of such a small space is an infringement of public and civil rights. The reason for this surveillance is closely connected to the reason for our investigation. The bar, as we learned, had been raided by police more than 50 times in the years leading up to the attack. On average, around once a month, this bar, 25 square meter, small bar with a couple of gaming machines in the back, a kiosk in the front, which was really a small meeting point for local young people who lived on the estates surrounding the Arena Bar, had been raided around once a month until it was indeed finally raided by a right-wing perpetrator in February 2020. Now, it was raided more than 50 times because of the demographic of those who attend our place. They are young people with migrant backgrounds, primarily. And those raids, as far as we could understand from the records that we had access to, were pursuing working or visa violations. Now and again, somebody would be caught with a small bag of weed in their pocket. What interested us here was the question of the emergency exit, which is above the number 6 on this diagram. Because when the perpetrator entered the bar, and he entered in the lower left corner, just near to the number 4, when the perpetrator entered the bar, the group of young men who were sat in the middle of the bar at the time of the attack, you see them in camera number 5 at the bottom of your screen. When the perpetrator entered the bar, that group of people, they ran into the dead end up near to the corner 1. What they did not do was run past the number 6 to the emergency exit. Now, why? Well, as we know from testimonies of survivors given to the police, they said when he came into the bar, there was no escape. All the doors, he said, were locked. And everybody knew the doors were locked, said another survivor. They'd been locked for years. They are referring here to the emergency exit. In police investigations, we learned that on 2 occasions, the door had been reported to be found locked, in 2013 and 2017. Not only that, but this map is drawn by the first police officer to secure the scene after the attack. And he marked on this map 2 doors that he found locked after the attack. While the map is not exactly representative of the real proportions of the bar, you'll see that those red crosses indicate a cupboard, the store cupboard, and the emergency exit. Now, what this means is that a bar that had been raided more than 50 times in the run-up to its attack, it's being subject to right-wing racist violence, murderous violence. Also, those individuals who had experienced many of those raids knew that the emergency exit, the rear of the bar, was locked, and so they had no way out when the perpetrator arrived. The public prosecutor, however, when faced with a request for an investigation into whether and how this emergency exit door could have been locked on that, decided to close the case by saying, it can't be said with any certainty whether the victims would have been able to reach the emergency exit in time if they had tried to escape that way. And in this quote, we see very powerfully an operation of the threshold between public and private knowledge. The public prosecutor here has closed down the only avenue civil society on behalf of the survivors and the bereaved families affected by the attack on the arena bar, closed down the only avenue that they have to understand a certain concealed preparatory decision, an allegation which circulates widely around this case and around this fact of the locked emergency exit, is that this emergency exit was locked at the request of local authorities, indeed at the request of the police, because they realized that when they raided that bar, people were able to leave by the rear exit. Now, hopefully, dearly hope that it is our privilege never to have been in such a space in which, unbeknownst to us, the emergency exit was locked. And to find such a thing out at a moment of crisis is a truly terrifying prospect. And this statement of the public prosecutor, that because there was no certainty over whether the victims would have been able to reach the emergency exit in time, this statement has a reason for closing the investigation into something much deeper, something much more significant, that police were allegedly closing emergency exit doors and locking them in order to make their work easier. This became our point of intervention because this was a spatial question. In forensic architecture, when we take on investigations, is always looking for opportunities to bring spatial analytic techniques, to bring the spatial research capacities that we have to bear in ways that can leverage precisely on the kind of wider questions that the answers to which were denied to the families by the public prosecutor's statement. So the first thing we did, as you see here, is to turn what we saw in the CCTV images that you saw briefly a few slides ago, which you can imagine was quite graphic material, into 2D animated plan. We tracked the movements of everybody in the bar, stopping the videos 5 times every second to ensure that we had their movements precise as they moved around the bar. The time period that we're talking about here is 9 seconds, between when one of the victims witnesses the perpetrator, gun drawn, moving across the lobby of the arena bar, this smaller building in the lower left corner. He moves the perpetrator first across this smaller room into the kiosk, where you see that 3 people were shot. They are indicated here by red circles. They are Ferhat Ünvar, Mercedes Kirpach, and Gökhan Götekin. It took him 9 seconds to take those 3 lives in the kiosk and to return to the door, the position where you see the red arrow now. In that time, as you see, 9 seconds later, after having seen the perpetrator, the individuals in question are grouped in a dead end, the top of the screen here, cowering behind the bar. Our question was, can we show that 9 seconds would have been enough time to reach the emergency exit had they run in a different direction? So what we did first was to track the movement of the victims from the moment they first realized that they were in danger. We tracked their speed too by measuring their movement, as I said, across 0.2 second into increments. Then we mirrored those routes as if to say, what if they had run at the same speed towards safety? Here you see those same routes. You will in a moment see those same routes here, mirrored precisely at the same acceleration and deceleration, moving toward the emergency exit at the top of the screen. Now, because route to the emergency exit is a tiny little bit longer. Here, what we did is we extended the routes of every individual at the top speed that they achieved. We believe this is actually still quite a conservative estimate for the time that it would have taken them because, well, have you ever tried to run at full speed into a dead end? Our conclusion is that if the group had run toward the exit, they would all have been out of sight before the perpetrator. Here we see what that would have looked like. If the group had run toward the exit at the time that they saw the perpetrator entering the bar gun drawn, as they testified to police that they did, then by the time the perpetrator returned to the door, all of the group would have been out of sight of the perpetrator before he had the opportunity to fire. And this evidence is crucial because it removes the central reason for the public prosecutor not to investigate. And it's also a visible example, a vivid example of the length to which civil society must go to force the issue and to try to push the state into action, which is exactly what the survivors of this attack did. Here you see Saeed Edris Hashemi, who was shot in the neck, very seriously wounded during this attack. His brother was killed in this attack. Saeed Mirza Hashemi was killed next to him in the arena bar. And the very first person to publicly present our evidence was, in fact, Edris, who had seen the perpetrator, first of all, at the start of that 9-second period. He took our evidence to the parliamentary inquiry as part of his opening statement. Now, the victims had been given the opportunity to speak at the opening of the Untersuchungsausschuss in Wiesbaden, which began in 2021. And Saeed Edris Hashemi brought to his opening statement a USB stick containing digital copies of our investigation and a methodology report, the text report of our findings. And for us, this was a very significant moment in understanding the contours of the counter-forensic practice and the civil society investigative practice in the face of the state's refusal to investigate. Because here, rather than a passive victim and as a passive recipient of the state's decision-making, awaiting the outcome of the process, rather here, Edris becomes active, leading the course of the inquiry, setting the terms, demonstrating that the victims and survivors have their own investigative agency, that they have the means to come to investigative conclusions independently, and this fact upends the power dynamics upon which state silence and denial are so often predicated. I want to turn now to the second aspect of our investigation, into the police operation surrounding the house of the perpetrator that night. The perpetrator spent only around a minute within the arena bar, during which time he claimed 4 lives, and shortly before that, the life of a 5th person outside, as I said. He left the arena bar and fled to his home, which was nearby, arriving there before 10:15 in the evening. It was not until 3 a.m., almost 5 hours later, that the Einsatzkommandos from Frankfurt broke down his front door, entered the house, and found the perpetrator and his mother dead in a murder-suicide. The perpetrator's father, still alive upstairs, claiming to know nothing. The families asked us to investigate, to help them investigate that police operation, how police had moved around the perpetrator's house, including their surveillance operation. Now, what we had to rely on there were police testimonies, part of a leak of the case files, but also leaked alongside that was footage from a police helicopter, which I show you here. Now, at this stage, we're seeing the scene above the arena bar. The bright white lights in the lower left-hand corner of the screen here is the arena bar, and the emergency services arriving. Helicopter has arrived over the scene. It's now about 10:30 at night. The very first thing that we noticed in the footage was this. The perpetrator, as I said, lived not very far away from the arena bar, and here we saw in his car parking space a glowing white shape, which was the warm bonnet of his car parked in his space where it would later be found. And so this told us that as soon as the helicopter arrived on the scene, it was visible that the perpetrator was already home. not far away from his house. Excuse me. Now, we used this helicopter footage. Here we are a little bit closer to the perpetrator's house. We used this helicopter footage to tell all sorts of things about the way that the police operation has unfolded. Here, for example, we identified 2 undercover police cars, including this here labeled Police 2. Police 2 is just about to start moving from a position from which he was surveilling the perpetrator's house. Here he is driving away from the position. He's just driving past the perpetrator's house now, and at this point he no longer has sight of the perpetrator's, the front door of the perpetrator's house, which at this point, now we're around 20 past 11 in the evening, we know the perpetrator is still there. We don't know if the perpetrator is still alive. Nobody knows that. However, we know that from this point onward, the front door of the perpetrator's house was not surveilled. Now, very importantly, this police officer claimed that he was surveilling his position, so that he was in position, surveilling the front door of the perpetrator's house for around 45 minutes. He said that he arrived before 11:15 and left around 11:20. Now, it was our work on this video, by identifying undercover police officers through the car's movements, cross-referencing that closely with police testimony. It was our work on this video which demonstrated that his claim, how long he had been surveilling the front door of the perpetrator's house, was in fact twice as long as he had in reality been there. Now, for us, these kinds of misleading statements, the failure of the state to interrogate or account for them. I should say that when I took this fact to the Untersuchungsausschuss in Wiesbaden and presented our findings, we were not permitted to show this video in the inquiry process. But when I presented these facts, when I shared that we knew that due to our video analysis, we knew that this police car number 2 had in fact only been surveilling the perpetrator's house for less than half the time claimed. This was, I can only conclude by the paucity of questions that came relating to this fact, that is to say, there was no discussion of this fact whatsoever. I can only assume that this was of no interest whatsoever to the investigative committee. And so the failure of state processes to interrogate or account for discrepancies such as this, when presented with clear evidence from civil society, for us, this really is the groundwork. This is the groundwork which permits and enables the continued structural failure to protect non-white communities in Germany from neo-Nazi violence, from acts of racist violence. Because it's exactly the denial of facts such as this, simple fact that this officer in fact left his position after only 18 or 20 minutes, leaving probably the most dangerous man in Germany at that moment, armed and unsurveilled. It's entirely the fortune of those that lived around the perpetrator, that the perpetrator did not reload his weapons and leave by the front door of his house. He would have been able to do that between about 20 past 11 and probably about 12:30, despite the Hessen police knowing precisely where he lived. Now, the fact that we were able to bring this material to the Untersuchungsausschuss, give them what's very clear evidence for that fact, and have it interrogated to absolutely no degree whatsoever. For us, this is the groundwork which permits people like Peter Beuth, the Innen Minister from Hessen, formerly the Innen Minister from Hessen, to say that this operation was, in his words, exzellente Polizeiarbeit, excellent police work. Oh, excuse me. This diagram, speaking of excellent police work, this diagram maps the results of our analysis of testimony, of the available video data, primarily the video shot by the police helicopter, to show where the police surveillance vehicles Not only that which we saw, which police car number 2 is the would have been positioned at the top of the screen here, where it says die hier aufgestellten Beamten waren höchst im Achten langer Position. This is, of course, the person that I was referring to. What we provided here toward our exhibition of our findings was a map which presents, in the officers' own words, and indeed in their drawings, exactly where they were positioned in relation to the house, and what that meant about what they were able to surveil. So you'll see that at the top of the screen, the police car that we've discussed, he stayed 18 minutes in position surveilling the front door of the perpetrator's house. The undercover police car in the lower left corner of the frame at the X1, X2, he was in position for around 30 minutes between 11 and 11:30 when the Einsatzkommandos arrived. The third car over on the right-hand side of the screen here, he admitted in his own testimony that he could see neither the perpetrator's car nor the front or rear doors of the perpetrator's house. His position was, by his own description, entirely blind. And this indeed was the excellent police work that Peter Boyd was so keen to defend, and that it has taken us and the initiative and the survivors and the families years since that time to only partially unravel. I conclude by talking about perhaps the most powerful venue that we have found so far to try and unravel and to try and build communities of response, coalitions of response to these refusals to investigate, these refusals to self-interrogate. What you're seeing here is images from our exhibition 3 Doors at the Frankfurter Kunstverein. It opened in June 2022, 6 months after Edris Hashemi had presented our findings at the Untersuchungsausschuss. We presented those findings and more here at the Kunstverein. We called this exhibition 3 Doors. 2 of those doors relate to the case of Hanau. One is the emergency exit of the arena bar, a door that was locked, that should never have been locked, that should have been open. One was the front door of the perpetrator's house, which remained closed for not only around 5 hours on the night when it should have been opened, should have been forced through, but let us not forget this was a perpetrator who was known to the Hessen police, who had written letters to the federal secret services, to the chief of police in Hessen, detailing what they planned to do. The door that should have been open, and a door that was locked, and a door that was closed, which should have been open. The third door related to the case of Uri-Jallo. In the to upper right-hand screen here, you see our physical installation related to the case of the murder of Uri-Jallo in Dessau. This, again, a case where a door operates as a threshold delineating the public and the private, the open and the concealed, and thereby the power of the state to decide how to pursue and protect civilians and citizens, how to pursue accountability on their behalf or not, and how to protect them or not. It was our contention that these doors, they're being open, closed, unlocked, locked, testify to the indifference on the part of the German state to the suffering of racialized persons and communities, and its enduring leniency, sadly, toward racist perpetrators. So this was a multimodal exhibition. On the top left, you see our investigation into the perpetrator's house, where the chairman of the Untersuchungsausschuss, Marius Weiss, for the first time ever saw the helicopter footage that I shared with you earlier. We were able to acquire that earlier than the state parliament's inquiry process. It's not clear why that was, and his seeing that here led to our being invited to the Ausschuss immediately. A very clear example of how cultural forums and cultural spaces can act as instigators from the outside on political and legal processes, driving new revelations new self-revelations by the state, and interceding in those processes. On the bottom right, you see videos produced by the initiative 19 February Hanau, in which the survivors and bereaved families who delivered statements at the Untersuchungsausschuss are given the opportunity to deliver those statements again to an audience that now, after 7 or 8 exhibitions of this show, numbers in the hundreds of thousands. These statements at the time, I should say, these statements when they were delivered to the parliamentary inquiry, they were repeatedly stopped. Politicians had to be stopped, had to be prevented from reading newspapers and eating sweets while these statements were being delivered. Suffice to say that the bereaved and survivors were deeply disappointed with how these statements were received, and so we considered it a function of the exhibition to have those statements which were so carefully and painstakingly crafted, which were themselves traumatic episodes, to construct and revisit accounts of the days after which people had lost their children, their brothers, their sisters. To see those statements and the trauma and the depth of emotion that had entered into those statements be so callously regarded by the politicians of the Untersuchungsausschuss, some of the politicians of the Untersuchungsausschuss, was really heartbreaking. And so we considered that a critical function of this exhibition was to provide those statements to a much more receptive and indeed wider audience. The exhibition itself even became a newsroom. Here you see Armin Kurtovic, the father of one of the victims, using the exhibition. Here we are in the entrance hall of the Kunstverein, using this space to present new evidence to the media. His own investigation, which we supported him in, of the CCTV evidence from within the arena bar. Here you see him presenting before and after shots showing his son, his own son is in these images, and his friends visiting the door at the rear of the bar, the emergency exit, and coming back seconds later. Doing this, coming back, it being clear, you see them rolling cigarettes, they want to go outside, they go to this back door, they find it locked, they come back to the front, and they go out of the front door. Now for us, this is a really remarkable example of how such spaces can be used, can become venues for the production of new evidence, production of new knowledge, the presentation of that information. You see before Armin here is the local press. Behind him are the families brought together, not only from Hanau, but families and friends of the bereaved of Uri Jallo, all behind Armin, as he presents vital evidence, critical evidence, which went then into subsequent legal appeals related to the death of his son. Hamza Kurtovic died that night in the arena bar. And this exhibition, this space, became the venue for that. Here we see at the show's presentation, a second presentation in Hanau itself, in the town hall, visits from senior state and federal politicians. This was Federal Interior Minister Nancy Faeser and the Minister President Boris Rhein, where the family members themselves are giving tours, presenting, directing the attention of senior state and federal politicians. Here, our exhibition becomes a direct line between the facts, the publication, the victims and survivors, and the responsible parties, the parties who have the means to effect change in this situation, the politicians overseeing the police at state and federal level. I'm delighted to say that this show has now toured Germany, it's traveled internationally, recently to Istanbul, and wherever it goes, that effort to puncture the cordon that the state places around this case, around its own culpability, around its unforgivable failures and the callousness of the years after, that effort to unravel and to challenge and to build new alliances, engage new publics, is led, as you see here, by the survivors and the bereaved themselves, by the supporters and their allies. And when I referred earlier to experiments, our experiment in puncturing the cordon finding ways to break open the veil of secrecy, to access that groundwork. These are our experiments. And this exhibition has indeed been a remarkable experiment in counter-forensic practice, in the integration of multiple disciplines and perspectives towards socialized knowledge production. Unlike the groundwork of Murphy's exhibition, which remains hidden and unremarkable, visible only in its consequence and effects, this act of knowledge production occurs publicly, occurs transparently, it grapples with its own limitations, it takes risks toward the production of building, towards the project, excuse me, of building alliances of action around that knowledge, and ultimately towards, we must hope, accountability and indeed justice. Now I'll stop there, and I'd be delighted to hear your thoughts and your questions. Thank you.
Hello, Rob. Bob, can you now see the audience?
I can. Hello. Hello.
Great,
sorry about
great,
that. Thank
great.
you very much. Yes, sorry.
So, I will start with one question, and then we open it to the public and also to those online. So as a lot of people in the room are coming from art, so my question is, so why is the art context so important? Could it be also in another context that you could present and have this what you called this counter-forensic experience? So what do you think? Because I also know that forensic architecture did start out first as a research group, and then later art came in. So maybe if you could comment on this relation between.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, you know, we understand the counter-forensic practice. We understand the need, that there is a need placed upon civil society investigative practice to work across forums, across multiple forums. That is to say that we want to work in legal processes, we want to work in political processes, and we want to work in cultural and media spaces as well. When the forensic process that I mentioned in my introduction, you can think of this as a straight line from the crime scene to the laboratory where the evidence is assembled, to the courtroom where the meaning of the evidence and the consequence of the evidence is rendered as sentence. This is a straight line, proceeds when the state is not involved in an uncomplicated fashion. When the state is involved, this straight line becomes tangled because the consequence, the direction, the direction of consequences is corrupted. And so what we see in our investigations, what we see in our counter-forensic practice is that we need to be able to move in a more versatile way. We cannot expect to simply move directly from crime scene to courtroom. Our straight line takes on multiple branches and different routes. And what I've been describing here in approaching the parliamentary inquiry, approaching the exhibition, finding then that the exhibition influences the inquiry process, that the exhibition creates new forms of evidence which then influence legal processes. This exactly is the complication of that straight line that we understand to be the counter-forensic practice. So absolutely, we believe that, and as much as possible, we want our work to be active in courtrooms, we want our work to be active in political processes, but no forum is without weaknesses, is without problems. We see, sadly, regularly the limitations of political and legal processes to deliver what looks like accountability or justice. You know, the courtroom, when it operates effectively as a venue for justice, it does so precisely by narrowing down context, by stripping away context. Courtrooms and legal processes operate by reducing cases to simple questions of certainty. And we find that spaces allow us to do exactly the opposite, which is necessary when we want to situate cases like Hanau in their wider, the wider context of racist and neo-Nazi violence in Germany, of police failure and impunity. One cannot understand Hanau in and of itself alone. It must be placed in context. It is not. It is no single case, no extraordinary case. And it's art spaces exactly that allow us to unwind from individual incidents to their broader context, to structural histories, what our director has called the long duration of the split second.
Thank you very much. From the audience?
Hello. My question is a little bit longer, maybe. So, and thank you for your very nice presentation. I really enjoyed it through. So, for me, what I see, if I can explain it very simple format. So, we are dealing with some real-time situations here, and the situation has a scenographical representation. So, if I can think like, let's say I'm designing a situation. There, I'm creating a scenography, a kind of architecture, kind of 3D, and pretending what can happen in that in future in that environment. And I find this part is like some event happened, and we are trying to rebuild the factor. Like, let's say from door 1 to door 2, how long it takes, the distance if you run. In a broader scale, like in the urban fabric, if there is a dead node or if somebody is driving one way, two way, what kind of situations are there? So all these informations and the recording, it creates kind of a situation which talks like, I would say it's kind of a sophisticated visual recording of the whole process. And the exhibitions, how you define this exhibition, it could be a presentation of a design process. Why it's art? Because what kind of private understanding or let's say abstract situations are there? How can I put in this as not as a design format, but a contemporary art format?
The question is sort of why do these works find a home in art galleries?
The question is why it is not design, why it is art? Because it is fulfilling a customer need, or there is a problem and a solution. That is a process of design, any design, industrial architecture, forensic architecture, and art is something different from design. So how you define this as an art but not as a design?
I wouldn't rule it out of either category. We consider that it's very productive to sit uncomfortably, however you look at it, between fields and disciplines. You know, we certainly we do consider that we're conducting, let's say, practices of information design. I certainly don't see that it's necessary to consider our work one or the other. Certainly, we are using aesthetic strategies to investigate in the first instance, and certainly to tell stories about what we find subsequently. I don't see that there's a dichotomy.
Yeah, it's a question. So if I go back to the a very basic example, long back, there was a situation when there some murder happened and the face of criminal, and there at the victim, they describe the criminal, and there is an artist who draw a portrait of the murderer or the criminal. Okay, so those portraits, should I consider as art or should I consider as information of the design?
That doesn't seem like I'm not sure. I'm not sure how that's pertinent to the work that we're doing. Maybe we can move on. Thank you.
Okay, I think it's better to go other questions. Thank you.
So probably we have one question from the chat. Not yet, not yet. So your opportunity.
Hi, and thank you very much for the talk. I have two questions, and both questions are more connected to the interface between the work you do and the world outside of the museum. I saw your exhibition in Frankfurt because I live in Frankfurt, and I also found it quite informative, so thank you for that too. My first question is, simply put, how you see yourself, how you position yourself within the accountability process, so to say. You know, so I think it is quite. It's a simple first point to say that you produce evidence, but that evidence is not the beginning of something, neither is it the end of something. No, so one simple example is that the evidence that you produced within the context of the Hanau shootings, you were invited by a group to produce it, right? So one sub question of it is like, how do you choose what to investigate, right? But I chose a more general way to put it because there is also stuff that happens after the evidence is produced, right? There's a life after the evidence. And do you see yourselves as stewards of the discourse, of the dialogue, of the way that evidence moves through the world, et cetera, et cetera? So yeah, the question is where you see yourself in that entire accountability process.
Wonderful, thank you. It's a great question. Yes, we certainly do. You know, we want to be evidence producers, knowledge producers. We don't consider that that's something that happens in isolation from the people that we work with and for. We feel that it's very important, and perhaps this touches on your sort of sub-question, how do we choose which things we work on? For us, wherever possible, we want to work on cases that we have been invited to work on. Came from a journalistic background where the opposite is true, where things become news and of interest to journalists, regardless of the wishes of the individuals involved in those stories. And that is not an approach that we, you know, it's not to say that it's never an appropriate approach, but that is not an approach that we follow here. We, as much as possible, we wish to be invited to work on the cases that we do by the people who are closest to the harm at the center of those cases. And so we want to produce evidence with and for the claims for accountability of those bereaved survivors, affected communities. And that's because we believe that that invitation is not, it's not incidental. It creates a different kind of, a different social arrangement through which knowledge is produced. And that gives us the opportunity to produce different kinds of knowledge which approach incidents such as this in different ways. And for us to be able to take the kinds of information, let's take the case of Hanau, of course, the kinds of information that we produce there, where we are both able to tell you in detail that a police officer spent 18 and not 45 minutes on scene, while also seeking, let's say more speculatively, though it is no speculation, to connect the failures of policing, the impunity for the failures of policing in the case of Hanau to the case of the NSU, to other cases across Germany. To simply put, you won't find another organization that tries to do those two things at once. And we don't believe that we're doing those things in isolation. We want those two things to occur together because we believe that they change one another and make one another richer. They also, and perhaps this comes back to the question of whether art, whether design, whether architecture, it's precisely those combinations which put us in those uncomfortable halfway positions between disciplines. And those are positions that we find, you know, we are fundamentally academic researchers. We have a research mandate to experiment with research and storytelling methods. And we find that being in those half spaces between disciplines is exactly where the most interesting tensions emerge. They are where very difficult questions emerge also when we enter into a space such as an Untersuchungsausschuss, and we see across us the politicians from the CDU, for example, the ruling party at the time, the majority party and ruling coalition, who have, it's fair to say, very little interest in the extent of police failure under their interior ministry being revealed, we see how our being slightly between the chairs of different disciplines, we see how that causes challenges for us. The questions that I was asked in that inquiry were primarily about my qualifications, about the qualifications of my colleagues. As I said in my presentation, exactly no questions were asked about what it means that that police officer did not surveil that house. So we see that there is, that in combining, let's say, the forensic and the aesthetic, in combining these two worlds, maybe more than two worlds, we create for ourselves productive tensions, but tensions that don't come without challenges. I just wanted to also address, if I may, in that context, Sidra has written a note in the chat here about frameworks that we have, or specific people that we have in place to support victims' families emotionally while directly interacting with them, while sort of inviting them to work with us. Because I think this really comes back to that question of invitation. You know, what we consider would be, you know, in danger of aggravating and escalating that trauma, is to take on this story and to take the agency that comes with telling the story, particularly we with a greater, let's say, mouthpiece than a broader mouthpiece than those families themselves, in the moment at least, and individually. It would be possible for us to take on that story, decide to tell that story, and in doing so to escalate, to aggravate the trauma that those families feel. What we find very often is that when that invitation is conducted and sought and found and made, we find that quite the opposite happens, that actually that process of agency, of combining resources across disciplines, combining technical experience or technical expertise with lived experience, we find that this can be actually a very empowering and very an experience which it does nothing necessarily to reduce the traumatic and emotional impact of reliving these events, but it engages with that trauma and with that emotion in a way which can be productive, empowering, and agential rather than, or active rather than passive.
So we have another question from the audience here.
So, hi, thank you for your speech. I have been following the work of forensic architecture for quite some years now, from the Beirut explosion to Hanau, to the cartography of genocide. And I wonder, and if you may have answered this and I've been tuning out, I'm sorry, but I have been wondering, how is the work of forensic architecture being perceived by German authorities, or going even higher to Israeli government, especially like the far right Smotrich and Ben Gvir, which must perceive your work. If you release the cartography of genocide, that must are you facing threats, or are you facing consequences for, I don't know, consequence might be the wrong word, but you know where I'm heading. Are you having trouble publishing that kind of work? And is this a problem for growing as an organization? Because the opening of forensics in Berlin is nice, and I saw that you were hiring people, and you're still hiring new heads of operations. So how is this interfering or being an agency for unheard voices? How is this interfering with your line of work?
It's a good question, and one that I want to answer carefully. Yes, it is. There have been easier times to struggle on behalf of human rights and international humanitarian law in Germany than today. certainly true. Our director visited Berlin at the end of February. He was to give a lecture with the UN Special Rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territories, Francesca Albanese, one of the UN's most senior and most qualified human rights professionals. She and he were delayed at the airport. The lecture at the Free University Berlin was cancelled as a result of pressure stemming from the mayor's office in Berlin, which we understand was at least contributed to by pressure coming from the Israeli embassy in Berlin. So we have a situation in which German state institutions are instructing universities to close down free discussion between senior human rights officials and leading Jewish intellectuals. That is to say, my boss, Professor A.L. Weitzman, who's been a long-time professor at the University of London. That's not a good situation to be in whatsoever. That's very, very concerning. And we and many other organizations in our field are operating cautiously and with both concern and resolve in the face of these kinds of circumstances. I can say, as far as I know, touch wood, we are not experiencing imminent threat, let's say. However, that's not the way that the authoritarian tendencies of this world need to operate at the moment. Not when a cultural environment and a civil society research and activism and art and cultural environment has been established, founded on the generosity of the German state. Generosity which is rapidly drying up, and which, as we saw in the cuts to the cultural funding scene here in Berlin, how those cuts were distributed, is undoubtedly being weaponized against organizations which speak the truth about the genocide in Gaza, and which have the temerity to do so on the German state. So we're still here. We will remain here for as long as we can. Can't deny that it's an extremely challenging environment to operate in. And let me say that all of you turning up and supporting us, it certainly means something.
Thank you, Bob. There are 2 more questions in the chat. I will read them out to you. As communicators, are there any key focuses you hold when it comes to the distribution process of the communication of your investigation? For example, is there a process in how you choose a gallery partner? Would you consider directly public-facing communication channels such as billboards or ad spaces, etc.?
It's hard to answer that first question. It's a very organic process. You know, you can imagine that we receive many invitations to conduct work. We receive many invitations to hold exhibitions, and in many cases, it's a project of matching those up effectively. I can say that the Frankfurter Kunstverein did not come to us wanting to exhibit a show about Hanau. They didn't know that we were working on Hanau. In fact, they wanted us to exhibit our work on the Pegasus software, the spyware software that has been so much in the news in the last few years. But we said to them, we have something we think will be a greater opportunity for you. That a survey show of forensic architecture's work from all around the world is not what a contemporary art gallery in Frankfurt can really do for certain communities that it would otherwise very rarely relate to. And so we said, just down the road from your gallery, we're already working with marginalized and racialized communities who suffered extreme violence and the slow violence of the state thereafter. And this is a wonderful opportunity for our institution and yours to work together to contribute to the struggle against that and the struggle for accountability. space. So that's one example of how we match up work with exhibition. Billboards in art space is an interesting idea. I have to say, I don't think that's ever occurred to us. It's the sort of thing we think is too expensive, but worth a thought. Thank you.
Thank you. And one more question from the chat. Thanks, Bob, for the presentation. The presented works on your artistic investigation are amazing. May I know how your team justify whether a claim, the outcome of your investigations are correct or support, align with particular conjectures of a case? Does the process involve confirmation from the related stakeholders as the witness? And if yes, who are they usually? To what extent the artistic outputs give effect in the court other than the common practice of verbally delivered witness?
Thank you. So what I hear in that question is how are artistic and aesthetic practices, let's say, or practices that could be that find a home in artistic venues or art spaces, how are they also legible as evidence? And that for us is exactly one of these productive tensions that I mentioned earlier. You know, there are many different thresholds of evidence, and certainly traditional courtroom environments are built to expect and accept certain kinds of certain modalities of presentation and testimony as factual or expertise. We see this spinning off into many different areas of our work. We talk a lot in our policing cases, which is where we also have had a great deal of opportunity to come into courtrooms and inquests. We talk a lot about the split second. Mentioned earlier, the long duration of the split second, the concept that my director has spoken about at length. The split second for us is a very, very interesting evidential object, and I think a good example by which to answer your question. The split second can be as long or as short as we like. Split second has no duration, particularly in the case when we're looking at cases in America. When a police officer considers themselves in danger in the US, they are allowed to fire their weapon until they feel that they're no longer in danger, and all of that operates essentially within the logic of the split second. We know that whenever we hear the term split second, particularly here in the UK, certainly over there in the US, we know there's a high likelihood, if we're talking about the split second, that a racialized person has been killed by the police. Why? Because the split second is an object which gives a sort of carte blanche to the officer. In fact, the perception of the officer during the split second and in the moments that cause the split second to be necessary, the perception of the officer is essentially evidentiary bedrock. It's actually very difficult to substantiate the claim, even if the evidence supports it. It's very difficult to even be to receive the permission to say that a police officer is lying. It's a very, very difficult thing to say, particularly in our experience in UK cases. And so what we need to find ways to do is to approach those questions of thresholds of evidence, questions of certain kinds of what constitutes evidence through on the term alternative grounds, let's say. It's in the concepts of the split second that you see that that courtrooms are designed and can be designed to preserve certain status quo, to continue certain function. And so it's perhaps there that we think that we need to step outside of those cases in order to outside of those courtrooms in order to begin to engage with and make visible evidence in different ways. As to how we justify claims, you know, we were born in the open source revolution. The idea here is that all of our work is transparent, that the process of proving is also baked into the proving, that our digital models allow us to show the assemblage of evidential complexes, evidential networks. We can take the viewer from one perspective to another, but I think it's also fair to say that something that we have to be very aware of in this work is the sort of aesthetics of what has been called truthiness. I don't know how well this translates, but the appearance of being truthful, and this is something that we have to be very mindful of, because it's certainly. I think back to when I joined Forensic Architecture 2017. Those years between 2017 and 2020, the explosion of our kind of work, 3D architectural modeling as a means of media investigation, spatial analysis, human rights work, was stratospheric. You know, the New York Times was copying us, the Guardian, the BBC, the Washington Post were copying us. They were all building their own teams, and within that context, we began to see sort of spin-offs. We began to see sort of let's say, fake open source investigation, adopting the aesthetics of the visual aesthetics of our kind of work. Indeed, we saw back in December of 2023, only a few months into the genocide, we saw the Israeli military publishing digital models of the Al-Shifa hospital, where they were claiming that the Palestinian resistance were hiding in the tunnels beneath and using this as an HQ. And they produced digital models which were evidently meaningless. They were representative of nothing, and yet it was a very clear example of states adopting the aesthetics of truthiness, the aesthetics of facticity from our work. I'm sorry, I've moved a little bit away from your question there, Asifa. Sorry.
No, I think this is a good.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
A way to end our discussion. I just like to quote from Claire Bischoff's latest book. She says on to forensic architecture that you are the vanguard of artistic-based research at the moment. And so, quote, after 2 decades of right-wing falsification, truth is back in fashion. Data produces information, information produces knowledge, and knowledge produces public truth, now in the service of explicitly ethical claims. So this is how Claire Bischoff describes your work, and we'd like to end with this. And Bob, thank you so much. Good luck and a lot of
Thank you very much. It's a very optimistic perspective of truth at the moment from Claire Bishop. Thank you very much.
Yes, we will have this discussion in our next talk. So thank you so much.
Thank you all for coming very much. Take care. Goodbye.